want to settle in and listen to Dr. Scott Hemmerling, who is joining us from the Water Institute. He is going to be covering impacts of the offshore oil and gas industry on communities. That's not the same title up there because I didn't have time to change it, but he's going to tell you all about that. Scott.
Well, thank you. So today I'm going to talk about really the historical development of the oil and gas industry in coastal Louisiana and the social responses to and drivers of that change. As you mentioned, this project is funded by a few different sources. There are several pieces of it. Right now, we're working with the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management and partnering with the Bureau of Applied Research and Anthropology at the University of Arizona with Diane Austin's group, who's going to bring qualitative portion to the quantitative data that I'm showing here. Part of this research was also funded by an earlier grant from the GRP, looking at economic well-being in communities in relation to ecological changes. And also part of this data comes out of a historical atlas that we developed at the Water Institute, looking at coastal changes broadly across Louisiana from 1950 to 2010. So the questions we're looking at here are, what are the overall shifts in demographic and social conditions in coastal Louisiana between 1950 and 2015? What are the major historical events or transformations that have impacted coastal communities during this time period? And how do current residents of coastal communities understand the drivers of the historical and contemporary changes that they see going on in their towns and cities? And how does this relate to oil and gas development in those communities? And finally, to what extent do people correlate demographic and social change with oil-related events and other environmental economic events that are local, regional, or national? So this is a 3-year project, and we're just getting ready to jump into our 3rd year of this. The first year was literature review and really gathering that historical data. A lot of it was census data. We gathered a lot of data on the infrastructure and the development of oil and gas over this time period. And also we began our qualitative data assessment during this time. The 2nd year was really starting to pull together and quantify the data, start really mapping it out and seeing what we have gathered over this time period. And also Arizona was out in the field doing some of the initial field work. And again, the goal of that is really to look at what we can do with the statistical data and the GIS data is show correlations. We can say this event is correlated to this change in the community. That's not necessarily causation. So that's where we bring the anthropologists in to really take some of the information that we show quantitatively, go out to the community and see if that is their experience, if the changes we see in the maps and the statistics in the GIS is what they experience in the communities. And then the 3rd year is really going to be pulling all of these data together, working directly with the anthropologists and trying to combine all of this into a coherent whole of a document. Because right now it's, we have the qualitative data, we have the quantitative data, we have multiple scales from parish down to community, down to block level, and trying to integrate everything into a meaningful story is really what the year 3 of this project will be. So today I'm just going to go through some of the trends in oil and gas development, look at some of the socioeconomic variables that we've seen change over time, look at environmental change. We look at things like tropical storm impacts, drought, extreme rainfall events, things like that over the same time period to try to tease out the impacts of oil and gas versus all of these other external drivers. And finally, we looked at economic well-being over this time period, understanding that oil and gas, there are push and pull effects of oil and gas. It's a tremendous economic engine for coastal Louisiana. There's also some environmental hazards. So looking at population movement in relation to oil and gas, we expect to see movement towards it in some cases and away from it in other cases. So here's just some of the variables that we look at in terms of community vulnerability. Stresses and shocks, as I mentioned, we look at extreme weather events, also changing economic conditions, understanding that changes in fisheries, for example, and over time as the fisheries industry goes up and down, or as agriculture starts consolidating from small family farms to corporate farms. Some of these impacts on the communities are also going to drive population migration. It's not just a single industry that drives what we see in population. Coastal land loss, as I mentioned, drought, river flooding, societal and legal changes. We don't get into that as much here, but I think one of the primary drivers of coastal change in Louisiana in the future is going to be NFIP and flood insurance rates. That probably has more of a potential to drive people away from the coast than a lot of the storm events themselves. Then community responses. How do communities respond to these events? How do they respond to oil and gas? How do they respond to hazards? How do they respond to positive and negative economic changes? You could see population change, people moving in or out, economic conditions. Are people becoming richer or poorer? Housing conditions. Do we see a lot of vacant housing? Do we see housing booms? There's a lot of these types of impacts that we see over time. So the first thing I'm going to talk about is oil and gas expansion. So when we look at oil and gas, when we think about offshore oil and gas, the question is, how do we look at this on a map? How do we take these points, lines, polygons that we see in the GIS and really understand that we have to create a surface? There's impact zones. How do we take all of the data that we've gathered from 1950 to present, looking at the growth of the oil industry? So a lot of this we went through and had to identify when the sites went out. We looked through a lot of historical research going into company records to see when facilities were built, looking at the aerial photos and maps, looking at USGS quads to identify when these facilities went in place. And I should say also for offshore oil and gas industry, we looked at upstream and downstream. We looked at kind of the system of oil and gas. So shipyards, pipeline coating, platform fabrication, kind of the upstream effects. We looked at the wells themselves, we looked at the pipelines, and then refineries, gas processing plants. So kind of the full system of oil and gas development. And a lot of the analysis we did, we looked at the toxic release inventory over a 5-year span to determine the frequency of release for each class of chemical to the NAICS code or SIC code. Where the total number of releases is greater than the overall mean, we included that chemical in the data set. So we looked at what are the common chemicals that are stored or released from these facilities, and then used the EPA risk screening environmental indicators model to look at chemical specific hazard scores. So essentially we looked at each facility, assigned it a hazard score, ran a worst case scenario release based on the average chemicals there to establish a buffer zone around each community. So what we have is a weighting of each facility and then a buffer zone looking at what the full spatial extent of that impact would be for those communities. So again, we created proximity-based buffers around this. We looked at the endpoint distance of a hypothetical release. And in some cases, we used the default isolation zones that the Department of Transportation established to determine what the potential impact zone will be for these facilities. So now I'm just going to go through it and look at how this looked over time from 1950 to 2010, beginning with 1950. And what we can see here, and we use the same scale for each of these, and we standardized it and weighted it, so we have a weighted hazards value for each facility. And again, this is the combination of all the facilities I mentioned earlier. So if we look at the growth from 1950 to 1960, 70, 80, 90, 2000, and 2010. So that gives us an idea of really the tremendous growth and expansion we've seen of the oil and gas industry. And it's not a steady growth. At times as offshore really expanded, it really picked up in the 90s, and we see a growth, and a lot of that's due to we need additional gas processing plants on the coast. Refineries have remained pretty steady for the last several decades. We haven't had a new refinery built, a full refinery built in the state. We see lots of gas processing plants come online. So they increase capacity at the existing refineries for the most part. But we also have to think about the percent of the workforce employed in oil and gas. And again, this is an industry that employs a lot of people on the coast. It's an important industry for Louisiana. And we can see that kind of a regionalization of where oil and gas employment is concentrated. And it does remain fairly steady through time. It starts dropping off a little in 90, but we still see fairly high levels in the same areas. But in addition to employment, we also, as I mentioned, have to start thinking of some of the other variables that we're looking at. Some of, for example, population growth. And when we look at, and part of why we were looking at this is thinking through hurricanes and tropical storms and what impact does this have on population growth. And as we start going through and looking at where these clusters of growth are, we see that there's these overarching social issues going on in the country that really tend to drive population a lot more than some of these storm events and things like that. For example, in the 40s and 50s, we start seeing really this urbanization, people moving out of rural areas into the cities. We see starting, the expansion growing between New Orleans and Houma down in the southeast area. And then as we were going through it, we hit this area in 1960, and we said, this is really unusual. This doesn't really match what we've seen so far, which is, these national trends of urbanization followed by suburbanization. We hit 1960s, and we said, there's something strange going on here. Well, one thing that was happening in the 1960s was the Vietnam War. And Fort Polk, located up where we see this area here, was designated by the military as one of the areas in the United States that most closely resembled the environment in Vietnam. So this is where we see a tremendous amount of growth in this time period. And this is another example where these outside social forces are really driving population a lot more than the things we were looking at, oil and gas and tropical storms and things like that. And then after that, we start seeing really that growth of the Circum-Pontchartrain area, that growth of population on the North Shore, and people leaving kind of the South, New Orleans and that area. And that trend continued into the 80s, into the 90s. It's more intensified. We start seeing Baton Rouge really starting to grow as part of that cluster. And then here's the Katrina years, is really where we see tropical storm impacts. This is really the one, even Betsy and Camille didn't drive in the 60s, and New Orleans didn't drive population exodus as much as Katrina did. But part of what we wanted to do is really, we are trying to tie this to oil and gas and some of the other industries that were occurring on the coast. But what we need to do, as I mentioned, is we need to start thinking of the different types of hazards that we see in the coast. A single shock event on community resilience, something like a tropical storm, understanding that, it might take a generation to learn how a region changes as a result of multiple shocks. It might take several generations to really, things like coastal land loss, which is really this slow, insidious process that everyone knows is occurring, but it's not anything that you can say, here's a change on this day, it's completely different the next day. So it's such a slow process, and it might take several generations to actually see these economic changes. And again, these are just some examples of, a little blurry there, but if we can see tropical storm impacts here, of 70 to 80, 80 to 90, we can see that there is changes each decade. There's not one decade that's the same. We can obviously see, and again, this is all on the same scale, 2000 to 2010, we can see that decade that included Katrina and Rita and all of those other storms were significantly higher in terms of hazards than any of the previous decades. And we see in 90 to 2000, Andrew, for example, one major storm in that decade that just cut a swath across the Morgan City area and up through that region. But we also looked at extreme rainfall events. And again, we see there's more of a cyclical pattern when we look at things like drought and rainfall, where over several decades we see an intensification and then a dropping off. And it's interesting that Katrina, for example, happened during a year when there was extreme drought. So we have this huge rainfall event, and we see all of these water-related hazards, but we hardly ever think of the issues that drought creates in Louisiana, especially when we have a lot of agriculture in kind of the southwest and that central portion of the state that rely on agriculture, and drought conditions can drive population as much as some of these other extreme rainfall events. So again, I'm not going to go into the statistics as much, but we can see over time, if we look at where the asterisks are, we can see over certain decades, certain hazards, or in the case of oil and gas development, certain things drive population growth more than others. In some cases, in the 2000s, tropical storm impacts obviously really had a tremendous effect on people leaving certain parishes. We see a lot of people moving out of parishes that have been impacted by tropical storms. In some cases, things that just don't make sense, and this is where statistics can be kind of strange. If we look at 1950s extreme rainfall events, driving population growth. Well, we don't want to assume that, well, there's a lot of rain in this community, so we're moving here. So obviously there's other outside factors going on driving population and in the 1950s. But we can see oil and gas development really was a strong driver of population growth in the 40s and 50s. And again, I want to reiterate that that's where having the anthropologists going out and doing their work can kind of ground truth what we're seeing going on here, because, as I said, we don't want to make assumptions based on what we see with these correlations. So one thing we also did here is we looked at a few different variables and created an economic well-being index. And because we were dealing with census data going back to 1950, we had to look for some consistent variables that we had across that time period. So we chose 4 variables to kind of look at the economic well-being of communities. That included employment levels, poverty levels, and poverty intensity, educational attainment, and home ownership. So those were the 4 variables that we used to construct this well-being index that could be consistently assessed from 1950 to 2010 with census data. And again, we can see 1950 on the left side. We can see some really low levels of economic well-being in southeast Louisiana. But by 1970, that really started shifting. We started seeing improvements in some of these communities in terms of economic well-being. But it's not consistent. We see a lot of ups and downs related to well-being, especially the 4 variables that I mentioned. We can see, especially by the 1990s, and again, this coincides with really the growth of the offshore oil industry. Now again, this is just a correlation, but some of it we've already started seeing with some of the initial results that Arizona has shown us that a lot of oil and gas movement is being driven, a lot of movement into the communities and economic well-being is driven by oil and gas. And we can see really the coastal zone is improving. And if we look at poverty, there's a lot of, we can see some of the economic growth going on in the coast. And we can see there are some consistent areas of poverty, especially up along the Mississippi River in northeast Louisiana, that those are areas where there's strong, persistent levels of poverty. And some of these are agricultural areas where corporate farming and stuff took over, and we have a lot of displaced tenant farmers who used to be on some of the land that are still out there and still trying to work on their farms. Again, if we look at taking all of the variables that I've talked about and combining it into this economic well-being score, we can see this change through time in economic well-being, with the blue being significantly above average and the dark red being significantly below average. And we can start seeing that really development of some of those long-lasting poverty areas that really, in terms of overall economic well-being, really are persistent through time. In 1990, we can really see New Orleans, even averaging out Orleans Parish, where you really do have this bifurcated population, where you have extreme money and extreme poverty in the same parish. And that's the case, and I should say also, with a lot of this, because we had to rely on census data, because prior to 1990, we didn't have census blocks or tracts really completed for the whole United States by that point. So for consistency, we really, 1990 onward, we do have census blocks and block groups and kind of smaller scale census data from that period onward. They had a lot of the urban areas tracted in 1980, but it really wasn't until 90 that the full US was fully tracted. Again, what does all this mean for oil and gas development? And if we look here, the top chart shows and the correlation between our different economic well-being variables, while the bottom looks at general renewable natural resource communities. So that's, in this case, a combination of forestry, agriculture, and fisheries, all combined. And we really did that as a comparison to see, decadally, how do we see some of those changes occurring? And we can see that this well-being isn't consistent across time. It's not a steady increase, a steady state, a steady growth or decline. It's very spiky and up and down. In 1970, for example, we saw a lot of correlations between, in this case negative, between oil and gas. In 2000, we start seeing some other strong correlations. And in some things, such as home ownership and educational attainment in particular, we start seeing really strong negative correlations. And actually, when I started this project and talked to Dr. Diane Austin from Arizona and said, okay, we're developing this index, we expect to see, oil and gas will drive some positive economic changes in these communities in things like home ownership and reduction of poverty and employment. And the one thing she said to me, and that's why it's great to work with people who actually work in these communities, she said, you're not going to see a positive correlation with educational attainment. She said a lot of people in these coastal communities drop out of school to go work offshore. And sure enough, when we went in, and you can see on the bottom line up there, strong negative correlations across the board for educational attainment. Now in some cases it's overweight. We see higher levels of employment, lower levels of poverty, but that's really there's some trade-offs that are occurring in some of these communities. So as I mentioned, really the next phase of this, and the phase that we're in the middle of really is starting to bring the community data in and tying this all together. So the initial results suggest that the development of oil and gas industry is not a primary driver of population movement and migration. It does affect it, there are some correlations, but it's not the primary driver. In some cases, it's these overarching social factors. In other cases, it's the Vietnam War. In some cases, it's tropical storm impacts. Now, the growth of the oil and gas economy does correlate with changes in economic well-being. Again, poverty, unemployment levels, property ownership, at both the parish and community scale. So I showed the parish level here. We also looked at community level. So we looked at the different cities and towns across the coast that we have census data on. And then the next phase, we're going to do some more deeper statistical analysis, but also start bringing in the ethnographic data. So mapping and assessing the historical interactions of oil and gas development to anticipate future impacts of development. So we want to try, part of why we're doing this and part of why BOEM is interested in this is they want to have an understanding of what impacts their industry has on the communities. So when they do an offshore lease and they understand where some of these, what's going to be needed as part of this. You're going to need additional gas processing plants. You're going to need to increase production at this refinery. So it's really for them to try to tease out the impacts of the oil and gas industry versus these tropical storm events and other external events. And again, as I mentioned, observed patterns in the data allow us to see significant correlations, but not establish direct causation. We can't establish the cause and effect from the statistical data. So the next phase, utilizing qualitative methods to assess the linkages. And as I mentioned, Arizona's been out there already doing some of the initial field work, and they're out in a few communities. The parishes highlighted in red are kind of those key communities where they're actually out doing the ethnographic data. In St. Tammany Parish, Cameron, and Calcasieu, they're not conducting the ethnographic data there, but we are using some existing ethnographic research that's been done there to try to pull some of those data in there. And the reason we wanted to do, especially that Area 5, is that it is one of the refining districts. Lake Charles obviously is very strong in oil and gas refining, and we wanted to make sure that part of this analysis covered what's going on in the refining areas. And then in St. Tammany Parish, some of their initial work that Arizona did when they were out in the field, actually talking to people in Homa, they discovered that some of the companies and some of the individuals in that area actually started moving to Covington and Mandeville and some of the North Shore communities. So we decided to add that and just start looking at some of what's going on in that community. And that's also a good example of a case where we have these multiple things going on at once. You have the tremendous population growth after Katrina, and kind of that movement up to the North Shore, and you also have oil and gas companies moving up there. Now, chicken and egg effect there are that the companies are probably moving there, so they're, you could say because their executives want to live in the North Shore. And that's probably a pretty reasonable assumption to make, but that's part of what we need to go through some of the existing data for that area. So as I mentioned, University of Arizona in the summer of 2018, went out and conducted formal and informal interviews in Terrebonne, Lafourche, and St. Mary parishes, and then gathered data using ethnographic field notes, participant observations in public meetings, and informal interactions with residents. And just a few of the initial findings, which, they're going to reinforce this, and once we provide more of our additional data to them, they're going to use the quantitative data that we're developing to better guide their questions and really get deeper answers from the communities. But a lot of times, interesting things that they found, kind of a staggered migration away from the coast. And that's kind of what the data is showing people. It's not a steady decline, it's kind of this punctuated movement of people away from the coast. Community members largely attributed the environmental factors as pushing people out. Coastal erosion, flooding, storm risk, cost of living, insurance, cost of rebuilding. All of these impacts are things that community members identified as things that are pushing them away from the coast. But they also did mention that oil and gas provides opportunities. So people were moving away from the coast up towards some of the petrochemical plants and some of the other plants along the river. So there's an opportunity. So as offshore oil and gas is lost, or there's instability in fishing, a lot of people are moving more inland, and this is what the community members said. A lot of people are moving to go work at some of the more inland plants up along the river. And then finally, there were widespread reports that people have left the region altogether, either to find work elsewhere or to move away from the hazards that we mentioned earlier. And so a lot of people talked about, is this a permanent move? How many people leave and how many people come back? And that was one thing that came up a lot in the discussions with the communities. And they also mentioned kind of the boom-bust cycle associated with oil and gas. So that's really a question for a lot of the community members here is, okay, how much of this movement that we see away from the coast is permanent? How much is it, just a typical boom-bust and people will be back at the next boom? I mentioned this is a 3-year project, and what I've shown now is kind of a summary, especially on the quantitative part that my team led at the Water Institute, and some of the initial findings from Arizona. But now as we go into the 3rd year, it's really how do we integrate these different parts? How do we develop a more coherent model of the impacts of oil and gas based on a combination of the qualitative and the quantitative data that we developed as part of this research? That's it.